Welcome. We're doing a regional profile on Beaujolais. I think this is such a fun topic to discuss. Beaujolais is a wine that is incredibly important both because of its history, because of the ebbs and flows that it's gone through in terms of its popularity. And there's a lot of exciting things that we get to talk about today, especially about the crus, the different flavor components that you might see, and what really gives us that characteristic. I think if you've never joined us before at Cork Buzz, one, welcome, sorry. Of course, you probably know that my name is Amber and I'll be leading you today. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. So I'm going to go ahead and put everybody on mute. This is just to ensure that there's no background noise during the class, but you have the ability to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, I definitely want to hear from you. And we definitely recommend that you use the chat function to talk to each other. Artem is on here. He's going to talk about some of his favorite producers as well. And if you do have any questions that I don't see in the chat right away, he might try to address them or go ahead and get my attention so I can answer those for you. The other reason I want you to use the chat is because if you've been to Beaujolais, if you've spent time in Burgundy, if you've eaten in Lyon, we want to hear your stories. So I want you to use the chat function and talk about what you're drinking today. And also, if you've been to the region, please share your travel tip with everybody else for when we do get to go. And also, I love it when you share the wines that you're drinking. So I know a few of you have some wine from Cork Buzz, the family de Trave, which is a negociant project of Jean-Louis de Trave. I know we have the Cuin d'Escombe, the Morgon out there, son of George d'Escombe. So this is really exciting as well. What else do we have? The Châtelard coming from Fleurie. I myself today am drinking the Domaine Couder. This is really exciting. So this is a wine coming from Fleurie, from the Couder family that also owns la Royette. So that a pretty well recognized Beaujolais wine, you might know of it. I'll talk about this a little bit as we go through the presentation. Another fun thing too, maybe you want to describe your wine but not tell people what it is, and you can let everybody else in the class maybe guess what cru your wine might be coming from. That could be kind of fun too, but that option's there for you, so enjoy. So let's get started. Talking about some Beaujolais today. This is a conversation that if you are among a group of sommeliers, you might hear a lot of talk about Beaujolais. We like to talk about this a lot, both for the difference of the crus and the regional Beaujolais AOP. Also because of the popularity, as I mentioned, the tides of popularity have risen and receded over time, of course, and also the changes that have been happening within the Beaujolais region really in a short period of time. And I would say that this short period of time is really within the last less than 100 years. The differences we've seen in a lot of the styles coming out of this region are really distinct and really important, which I think is fun. This is somewhere where I think we would all love to be. This is a Beaujolais hot spring in Japan. The Japanese, they love Beaujolais wines, especially the Beaujolais Nouveau. And I looked up this statistic, and I can't remember when the article was written, but it said in the previous year when this article was written, the US imported 1.8 million bottles of Beaujolais Nouveau, and the same year Japan imported 7.9 million bottles. So you can say that you can see they really lead us in terms of Beaujolais Nouveau consumption, and so much that they really throw a party when it is released on the third Thursday of every November. So I think that's pretty fun. This is not just Beaujolais in the bathwater, so don't be alarmed. It is more of a hot spring situation. There's a little bit of Beaujolais, but it's mostly just colored warm water within the spa here. But I would try it out. I think that could be fun. So what will we talk about today? The history of Beaujolais. You won't find a lot of surprises here if you're familiar with the history of Burgundy. We'll talk, of course, about the geography and climate and what you can really expect based on the wines. And, you know, we talk a lot about different techniques in the vineyard and within the winery. And sometimes we don't pay enough attention to what we should really expect to know as a consumer about what that means. So we'll talk about things like carbonic maceration. We'll talk about what to expect from Gamay versus maybe Pinot Noir, although we won't be talking too much about Pinot Noir today. We'll talk about what to expect from the crus versus the regional appellation of Beaujolais. So the viticulture, vinification, of course, the grapes, but really we're talking about one grape. Beaujolais, although many grapes are actually permitted, it really is a monoculture. So Gamay is a huge portion of what's grown here, and more than 50% of all the Gamay grown in the world come from the region of Beaujolais as well. We'll talk about wine law, of course, because we love it, and we'll talk about the major crus. We're going to talk about all 10 crus. Some maybe might be considered to be more important than others, but we'll just kind of break these crus down and see what you might expect from these general characteristics. So where in the world is Beaujolais? We're located south of Burgundy, which you can see here. So we're within the Burgundy area. It's considered collectively to be part of Burgundy, along with places like Chablis in the far north. So you can expect, of course, that the characteristic that we might get from a white wine region like Chablis and a red wine region like Beaujolais might be quite different, with the region of Burgundy in between, really talking about a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir here, of course. But you can certainly see that although we're in central France, we're to the east. We have a very continental climate, but we're quite close to the Rhone Valley. And you can see that we're closer to the Rhone than we are to some parts of Burgundy, although Beaujolais is part of Burgundy itself. So important to keep in mind. And because of that, we do see a little bit of Mediterranean influence here. We are in a continental climate with 4 distinct seasons, but this Mediterranean influence, we don't have olive trees and things like that in Beaujolais, but we do see these sort of warm, dry summers that is an effect of the Mediterranean climate coming from the south. So a little bit of importance there. So what can we tell you about Beaujolais? So let's put this into perspective here. So it does overlap Morgon, or the Mâconnais, in Burgundy itself. Mâconnais is really known for its white wine production of Chardonnay. Most of the Beaujolais does lie within the Rhone department. So post the French Revolution, we split up these sort of regions. They were known as more like provinces. And within these provinces, at the time, it was like the Grand Bourgogne, were a lot of these wine regions. Post the revolution, we split a lot of these areas, these provinces, into departments and regions. And oftentimes, the wine producing regions themselves did not go with the same department. So it's not uncommon to have the wine producing region belong to several departments, as with Beaujolais, where most of it's actually further south within the Rhone department. We are quite close to the Rhone Valley, so we'll talk maybe a little bit about that, but some fun, I have a fruit fly flying around, some fun things happening there. Live classes, guys, so fun. Burgundy is 30,000 hectares, not including Beaujolais, and Beaujolais is about 17,000 hectares. So you can see that it's quite a bit of land by comparison to Burgundy. We do have this continental climate. It's a very, very slight Mediterranean influence. I think if you had to remember one of those things, remember continental, not Mediterranean. But it does have a little bit of an influence on the summers of Beaujolais. And what's really important to talk about here are the granite soils. These granite soils are igneous and metamorphic. We see a lot of shift as well. And they were really pushed up through the surface of the earth. Granite formed under the surface of the earth, at the same time that the Massif Central was being pushed up and formed during this area as well. So these soils are extremely ancient. And these granite soils are really in the north. So they're the northern part of Beaujolais, and this is where we see our 10 crus that we'll get into talking about today. Further south within Beaujolais, you don't have quite as much granite. The hills are quite flatter. Excuse me, the land is flatter. We don't have as many hills. And also because of this, you see more sedimentary soil within the area. So a lot more limestone and clay, much more similar to what you're actually seeing further north in an area like the Côte d'Or, the Côte de Nuit, and the Côte de Beaune. So we'll talk more about that. We'll keep that in mind. So let's talk about some history. No surprises here, really. I think if you've studied French wine history at all, We know that the Romans were really some of the first to spread viticulture throughout France. They were known for terracing slopes above riverways, above these sort of agricultural thoroughfares, and they brought a lot of their expertise, their wine growing and winemaking knowledge, and left it here. And it really became a big part of what happened over thousands of years to lead up to the culture of wine today within France. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Benedictine and Cistercian monks really cultivated the vineyards and made wine during this time. They really kept the spirit of viticulture alive, and then a lot of local lords came in. They took over the land during this time as well. In the 10th century, the Dukes of Beaujolais were ruling the area. Beaujolais was a town from which the Beaujolais region now takes its name. So kind of known by this name, or the Beaujolais town, since the 10th century. In the 14th century, we see the first written mention of what we assume must be Gamay, written as Gamaz, probably the first written reference to this particular grape variety. And in 1395, Philippe the Bold, a Duke of Burgundy, outlawed the cultivation of Gamay in Burgundy. He said that Gamay, and by comparison to Pinot Noir, was a bad and disloyal vine. But a lot of the agricultural peasants of Burgundy itself cultivated Gamay. So although it was ripped up quite a bit within northern Burgundy and the Côte d'Or, it really found a home further south in what would become Beaujolais. So the grape really migrated. And not all of the Gamay, of course, left the Côte d'Or as well. We still see it. We don't make Gamay itself within the Côte d'Or, but we do make a style of wine known as Passe Grand, which is a blend of Pinot Noir, which is more heavily planted, and Gamay itself as well. Most of the wine was made and consumed locally by the surrounding areas that were reachable or navigable by rivers. So Lyon was really important for the consumption, being the closest major city to Beaujolais. Of course, as well, consumed a lot of wine locally within the region. In the 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, many of the wine regions within France were connected to major metropolitan areas. So this was a great thing for smaller regions who, prior to the railroad system, didn't have access to these large areas. But it maybe wasn't as great for places like Chablis that were traditionally close to somewhere like Paris. And now suddenly Parisians are interested in other wines, not necessarily just Chablis. But Beaujolais became very fashionable during this time. Now, in Lyon, it was common for the people to drink this young, fresh, en primeur style wine. And they drank it as a harvest wine. So they were taking the Gamay from Beaujolais and they were drinking it as it was first vinified. So this is sort of the first style of Beaujolais Nouveau that we were really drinking. In 1936, after the creation of the Appellation des Origines, 8 of the 10 crus were established. Saint-Amour followed in, I think, 1946, and Régny in 1988. And in 1951, French law changed to permit nouveau wines, or en primeur wine. And at this time, they said that they could be released by November 15th, or November 15th, following the harvest of every year. So this is the first law enacted that said when we can release these wines as nouveau. Now, I think when we consider the term nouveau or new, we oftentimes always think about Beaujolais, but this is a style that's important to a lot of wine regions, not just within France, but really within Europe. And I think we're seeing some of these styles take root even in the New World. I know of some California producers that are doing nouveau style wine that I think is really fun. But Loire Valley is known for its en primeur wines, of course. Other places within France, even places like Rioja might do a younger style of wine. They certainly do carbonic wines, which we'll talk about in a few moments as well. And the style grew in popularity. So between the 1970s and 1980s, Nouveau became wildly popular. And it really put Beaujolais on the map for a lot of wine drinkers, especially within the New World, within the United States, within places that were not necessarily historically wine-consuming countries, the Asian markets. And because of this, with everything, eventually a lot of low-quality wines came to dominate the markets. And a lot of the wines became known as this Nouveau. And we lost kind of the idea and the concept. We didn't realize that a lot of the wines that could come out of Beaujolais could really be terroir focused. And could certainly be serious wines that were meant for aging. So I think we're beginning to see this again, which is really fantastic. In 1985, we changed from November 15th to the third Thursday of November every year for the release of Beaujolais Nouveau, and it's still released this day every year. It's oftentimes snapped up and consumed almost immediately. There are parties all over the world, but especially here in New York. We've never really done a Beaujolais Nouveau party at Corkbud, but I know they're popular at places like Compagnie Servin du Natural. But it is released a little bit less and less to the fanfare that it was in the previous decades every year. So we're really starting to focus on the crus of Beaujolais and this more serious style. And one of the reasons for that was because of an importer named Kermit Lynch, who a lot of people are familiar with. Within our book club, we just read his book recently. And he found this gang of 4 producers within the cru of Morgon who were following the works of a viticulturalist named Jules Chauvet. And they really are known for pushing natural styles of winemaking. They were using very low sulfur. They did not want to use filtration. They were not producing their wines in a nouveau style. But you know, a lot of people look at them as the natural wine producers or natural wine pushers, which they certainly are. But I think really what was at the heart of what they started to do was just bringing more of this recognition back to these quality terroir-focused wines of Beaujolais. And they certainly did a wonderful job at that. And the wines that are made at their domain today are still some of, I think, the most important that are coming out of Beaujolais as well. So what is Beaujolais Nouveau? Now you know how wildly popular it was. You saw people bathing in Beaujolais Nouveau in the first slide. We know that it was once a huge commercial success. So for years, it was kind of the overall image of Bordeaux. It really is kind of the image that Bordeaux sort of hangs its hat on in terms of its global recognition to begin with. George Dubois, who is the region's largest producer, became a household name. He was really the producer who released a lot of this wine to the market and became really known for it. When you have a wine released in this style, which we'll talk about, it is fresh, it's fruity, it's pleasant, but it's not necessarily complex. It certainly is a wine to be drank very young. We tell people if you walk into a shop and it's, you know, Thanksgiving and you want to drink Beaujolais Nouveau, that's fantastic. If you go into that same shop, let's say in August, and you see that there's still bottles of that same vintage of Beaujolais Nouveau on the shelf, you're probably not going to want to drink them. If they're like $20, would you take a risk? Maybe. It might be interesting to see what happened with that bottle for a $20 gamble, but most likely that wine was really produced to be able to be consumed as young as possible. So it is a harvest wine. These wines ferment for a very short period of time, and they go into bottle almost immediately after the fermentation finishes. This is why sometimes Beaujolais Nouveau has a little spritz to it as well. But it lends a softness to the wine and a lot of intense aromatics, and that really instant approachability that I was just describing. So these wines are produced through a process called either carbonic or semi-carbonic maceration. We have a lot of cool fermentation temperatures. So one of the reasons this became so popular within the 70s and the 80s, of course, is that we began to understand technology. Producers began to purchase temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks. And what this does is it helps preserve fresher fruit aromas and flavors in wine. So this is why we often use stainless steel for white wine production, because again, we're trying to keep those fresh fruit flavors, right? Especially in white wine, which we oftentimes also think about consuming young as well. Not always, but sometimes. Extremely short skin macerations, 4 to 5 days, sometimes even less, could be 2 to 3 days for this style of wine. And the flavors that are associated with these are very like fresh fruit. pomegranate, raspberry, cherry, strawberry, almost this kind of like Twizzler characteristic, a little bit of candied fruit, banana, bubble gum, and pear drop. So really aromatic, really fruity, and really light on the palate. They should be very fresh. They should be wine that you should actually want to drink with almost a little bit of a chill on them because they're so light and they're so fresh. George Dubouf, of course, making wine to sell, not just for what's in the bottle, but also for what's on the label, but a style of wine that's instantly recognizable by people all over the world. So let's talk about all the nerdy things, all the science behind how this happens. Check in with the chat, see how you're doing. Oh, great, I see some questions on carbonic and semi-carbonic. So that's Venkat, that's a really great question. So typically we say, I mean, I've heard different things as well. Oftentimes we associate it with carbonic maceration because maceration because it does happen. We do see these flavors a lot with this, but there are ideas and discussions that it could also be attributed to the yeast that's most common or most commonly used within Beaujolais production as well. Yeast is really what adds a lot of flavor to wine, yeast and fermentation. Like if you think about if you would just crush a grape or eat a grape or crush a grape into juice, like it doesn't really taste like wine, right? So a lot of that flavor comes from fermentation. You can purchase commercial strains of yeast that will help increase fruity flavors in your wine or other flavors within the wine. So there's definitely some talk about the concept that it could be more about the yeast that's commonly used within the region as well. But I've heard it both ways. A lot of times we still attribute it to the carbonic maceration because they are flavors that we often find in the Nouveau style wine. That makes sense. I mean, sometimes the best thing about wine is, you know, somebody else always has a different opinion. So carbonic and semi-carbonic maceration. So carbonic maceration is the lesser utilized of the two. In this case, we'll take whole clusters of grapes with the stems or whole berries, but the berries cannot be crushed. So a lot of traditional red wine fermentation, you're going to take your grapes, whether they're on these stems or whether they're not, and you crush those grapes to help release juice and begin that alcoholic fermentation, either with commercial yeast that we're adding or the natural yeast on the skins of the grape. So carbonic maceration, we're taking these whole clusters or whole berries, and we close them in a sealed vat. So usually stainless steel at this point. And within that vat, we pump in carbon dioxide. Now we're in an inert space. There's no anaerobic activity. We don't have any oxygen. And instead of fermenting like we just described, juice with sugar coming in contact with yeast, yeast eating that sugar, just like when we proof our yeast for bread, right? You add a little bit of warm water and some sugar, the yeast starts eating that sugar, creates that. We don't have that with this carbonic maceration. So in the process of this carbon dioxide, glucose and malic acid begin to metabolize, and they start to produce alcohol and carbon dioxide without the aid of yeast. And oftentimes this happens within the skins of the grape, so inside of the grape itself. So we call it an intracellular fermentation. The anthocyanins and tannins move from the skin to the flesh of each grape, and eventually, because there's cellular activity happening on the inside of this grape, the grape will typically burst and the juice itself begins to run out. Now, we oftentimes are not fermenting the juice that's run out of the skins of these grapes with the skins themselves, where a lot of that tannin actually resides. So we get a lighter style color, and we also get a lot of softness on the palate because you don't get as much of that tannin from the skins of the grape themselves. Now in carbonic maceration, after these grapes have ruptured, they're usually only fermenting to about 2% alcohol, so you can't create a wine this way. So usually we press the juice off the skins of the grape, and we ferment the juice by itself. So if we were making Pinot Noir in Burgundy, we would probably have a 2 to 4 week fermentation with the juice on the skins of the grape to gain that color, to gain that complexity, and to gain that tannin. Here, we're really avoiding the skins so that we can create this fruitier style of wine. And then we do ferment the juice to dryness with the normal activity of yeast. Now, more common is semi-carbonic maceration. That's the more traditional technique, and we don't do this in a sealed vat. So because it's not a sealed vat, we're not adding the carbon dioxide. Instead, we're taking these whole clusters and we're piling them into a large tank. So this could be a barrel, it could be cement, it could be stainless steel. Now, the grapes on the bottom of this huge mass or this huge barrel will naturally get crushed under the weight of the grapes on top of it. And these grapes at the bottom start naturally fermenting. Now, remember, there's yeast everywhere. They're actually one of the biggest concerns for a winemaker is making sure that your grapes are intact, that they don't get crushed between the vineyard after they've been picked and the winery, because you don't want that fermentation to start without, in a way, being controlled in the right container, in the right environment. So everything will start to ferment because it's already in contact with yeast. So if the yeast gets to the sugar inside of the grape, that's going to happen. So that's what happens here. The whole clusters at the bottom are crushed naturally, and they begin fermenting normally. So on the bottom, you have a regular fermentation based on the yeast on the skins of the grape and the sugar inside. Now, carbon dioxide is released out of the grape by fermentation, right? Yeast eats sugar, it creates heat, alcohol, and carbon dioxide. Now, because of this carbon dioxide is going to filter out of this juice that's fermenting, it's now blanketing the grapes that are above it in this vat. And eventually coming out and releasing. But because of this carbon dioxide blanketing these grapes that are above the fermenting ones, now we have this process of carbonic maceration happening to these grapes. So the same thing is happening to these grapes on top. They're going through this intercellular fermentation. They begin to burst. We naturally have this fermentation happening after these grapes are bursting. And then eventually, again, the same. Usually we spend more time on the skins with carbonic maceration, but then the producer will choose to press the juice off of the skins of the grape, or they'll take the free run juice that is burst out of the grape, and then they'll ferment that to dryness for wine without the skins. How are we doing here? Does that make sense? So this creates a different style, and carbonic maceration is used in many places in the world. You see it oftentimes in different wine styles coming from the New World. It's common in places in California. I've seen it in, for wines in South Africa. You see it in wines in the south of France. It's common for Côte d'Ivoire style wines. You also see it in Alavesa and Rioja. So it's not exclusive to Beaujolais. There's actually a lot of regions within the world that use this style, that implement it to create these fruitier, easier, everyday drinking wines. So the little diagram. So you see these grapes are fermenting naturally. They release carbon dioxide. That blankets, we're blanked here in carbon dioxide, and we're creating this intercellular fermentation. So now let's talk about Beaujolais itself. Let's see. To check in on, you guys look like you're doing good in chat. Cool. So let's talk about Beaujolais. So primarily a red wine growing region. The facts usually stay between 95 and 99%. I suspect that that will actually even go up. If we're at 95% red wine, they do produce some white wine. There's also quite a bit of aligote planted in the area. Depending on what commune you're in, you can release the aligote as Bourgogne aligote as well. Most white wine coming from Beaujolais is released as Beaujolais Blanc, but depending on where you might be, if you're maybe a little bit further north, or depending on which commune you're in, you might also be able to release that Chardonnay as Bourgogne Blanc too. But we're seeing, I think, less and less of this, and they do also have plans to phase out aligote by 2025, so we probably won't be seeing that grown within the area for much longer. Gamay is the most important grape, of course. Over 95% of what's grown in Beaujolais, more than 50% of the world's acreage is in Beaujolais, as we mentioned before. It is the offspring of Gouais Blanc and Pinot Noir. So it's a sibling to grapes like Chardonnay, Aligoté, Auxerrois, Romorantin, and Melon de Bourgogne as well. Of course, we do see Chardonnay and some Pinot Noir as well coming from the region, although not quite as important as it is further north. And we have 11 AOPs. So Beaujolais is its own AOP with two distinct title that you might be able to use on the label, which we'll talk about in a moment. And Beaujolais AOP is authorized to produce red, white, and rosé wine. They do produce a small amount of sparkling wine as well, but it's not authorized under Beaujolais AOP, so they don't call it sparkling Beaujolais. And then we have 10 northern crus, each with their own AOP as well, their own appellation d'origine contrôlée. In southern Beaujolais, this is where we see most of what comes out of the region. So much flatter, as I mentioned before, more of those sedimentary soils that are more similar to what we see in the Côte d'Or, limestone clay, similar to what we might see in Mâconnais as well. Some of the Chardonnay coming from this lower part can really be quite wonderful. Really like the producer Jean-Paul Brun or Terradores, makes a really great Beaujolais Blanc that I've always enjoyed as well. Most of the Gamay that's coming from the southern area of Beaujolais, just your kind of everyday, your generic Beaujolais AOP. Most of that Gamay is kind of entry-level wine. And most of the wine, or more than half of the wine that comes from southern Beaujolais, the Beaujolais AOP itself, is used for Nouveau style. So this is where the majority of that is going to come from if you're looking for your everyday kind of easy drinking Beaujolais or everyday Beaujolais Nouveau, if you want to drink it soon and early enough as well. As I mentioned, so two distinct sectors that you might see on the label of Beaujolais AOP. So the first would be Beaujolais-Villages. Now, I think we see village happen, we see this term used in a lot of wine regions in France. And this is an opportunity for the generic AOP to highlight some of the better terroirs. So this was once its own appellation, but it was subsumed by the larger Beaujolais AOP. And I think in 2011, I have that up here. It's a little bit less than half the acreage of Beaujolais. So you might not be able to see this, but you can see everywhere in this sort of tan, yellowish mustard color, if you will. It's for Beaujolais and primarily Beaujolais Nouveau. So you do have some parts in the north, but they're not located within the crus. Beaujolais-Villages is the lighter pink, and then the cru Beaujolais is coming from the darker purple areas here. So in Beaujolais-Villages, it is a higher quality wine than what you would see for your generic Beaujolais AOP. You can also produce red, white, and rosé for Beaujolais-Villages. It does require a slightly higher potential alcohol and lower maximum yield, theoretically increasing the quality of the grapes and therefore the wine as well. If the grapes are sourced from a single commune, the wine can actually carry the name of that commune in place of the word village on the label. So there are 30 communes that you might see that can append their name, and there are 38 communes within the Beaujolais-Villages area. Another term that you might see is superior. This is not that common anymore. It was important in the 1930s after the creation of the AOP, but it doesn't really see a lot of superiority today, unfortunately, but it is for only red wine, so superior you won't see on a label of rosé or white. It's a higher minimum alcohol, 10.5, theoretically telling us that we have riper and therefore higher quality grapes going into the wine itself. So not as common, but you might see it. And now we'll talk about the crus. Now, I think I have to say, I hope I don't say Grand Cru, but sometimes my brain works faster than my mouth, and I'm trying to connect the two. And it's so common now, people become confused sometimes with the term cru in Beaujolais. Now, there are no Grand Crus, but there are no Premier Crus within Beaujolais. In this case, these individual A's are simply known as Beaujolais Crus. And we'll talk about the different crus that we have here. This is a little departure from what you see in places like Alsace or Burgundy or Champagne, where we typically see the Grand Cru and then maybe Premier Cru vineyards as well. So we'll talk about these 10 crus: Sonnemours, Juliana, Chenin, Morgon, Fleurie, Cherubel, Moulin-à-Vent. We'll talk about Renier, Morgon, Bruy, and Côte de Bruy today, of course. So we're going to talk about these crus from north to south. All of these crus sit on these granite soils, these schist soils that we were talking about earlier. However, there is differences, there's slight differences within these soils based on a lot of the mineral and the crystal and content within the soils, which is really what necessitates categorizing these soils into these different crus. And these different soil types, although again all granite based, do lend different characteristics to the wines themselves. So some of these can kind of be classified as your kind of lighter, fruitier styles. This would certainly be something like Cherubel and Fleurie. Renier are usually kind of considered your light, elegant, fruity, floral, your kind of traditional, more Beaujolais style. You have your really structured crus. Those would be things like Morgon, Chenin, Moulin Avant. Have a lot more structure to them based on the soil, which we'll talk about when we get there as well. And then you kind of have ones that are a little bit in between. So Côte de Brouilly is a little structured. We have Juliana, Sonamore. These are all like slightly structured style crus that still have a lot of this beautiful fruitiness to them as well. And you can kind of think that we're showcasing the Gamay grape, but with a little bit more complexity and structure than we're finding further south within Beaujolais AOP. So we'll start in the north and in Saint-Amour. And a lot of times wine people like to use mnemonics. So you probably heard about this before. And I don't know who came up with this mnemonic, but I always found it really to be really interesting to remember the crus of Beaujolais from north to south. Some Japanese Canadians marry French Canadians, making really beautiful babies or really beautiful children. And I have no idea who came up with that mnemonic, but it's always stuck. And it does help to remember these crus from north to south when you try to remember where you might find these certain crus as well. In Saint-Amour, the crus will be, the wines will be lighter bodied. They're a little bit less concentrated. It's one of the newer AOCs, one of the newer crus within Beaujolais as well. Oftentimes these wines become quite popular around Valentine's Day as well, of course, being known as Saint Love. But you don't see a lot of these wines imported into the US unless it's really around Valentine's Day. So not one that's quite as well known. We do have a larger production of Beaujolais, not Beaujolais, Beaujolais Blanc, Chardonnay that's produced here as well. But it can't be released as a cru wine. So again, Chardonnay can only be released as Beaujolais Blanc as well. Moving down to Julianas, one of the most ancient wine growing regions within Beaujolais, with root within the Roman era. The wines are made within 4 communes. We think that these names Juliana and Julie, presumably, of course, honor Julius Caesar. Many of these vineyards are south-facing here. We have higher granitic hillsides. And in the east, a little bit of a lower elevation. There's some alluvial sand and clay, so we're seeing a little bit of the differences in these soil types here. But the wine can be a little bit unpredictable. Now, this is probably because of these higher granitic hillsides and these lower elevation sand and clay sites, that the area is a little bit larger, so we don't see as much cohesiveness in all of the wines. So there's a lot of vine acreage within the area, almost twice as more as what we see in Saint-Amour. And a third of the production is done by a local cooperative, La Cave des Producteurs de Juliana. So you might see that as well. But they do have a couple of domains that are quite important too. So Pascal Granger and Domaine du Clos du Fife, which I think see quite commonly within the New York market as well. But to remember, slightly fuller bodied than Saint-Amour, but of some varied quality due to the differences in aspect and soil type within Juliana, and just also because of the size itself as well. Chenin is really a favorite of mine. I've really very much enjoyed many of these wines when I've had them, although I don't see them often. They're quite rare as well. The smallest of the 10 crus, the production is quite small. It was previously an oak forest, and Chen means oak, although these vines have replaced this forest, of course. A lot of the wines, to my understanding, are consumed locally. The locals like to call Chenin a bouquet of flowers inside of a velvet basket, alluding to we begin to get into these really kind of floral styles of Beaujolais and of Gamay. we do see a fuller body, slightly more tannic. And they like to say that you shouldn't drink Chenin with less than 2 to 3 years of age on it. So they certainly think that it needs a little bit more time. Now, Chenin AOP, if you're in the south part of Chenin, around the commune of Chenin itself, the producers cannot actually choose to label their wines as Moulin Avant. So in southern Chenin, certainly you're going to begin seeing this more structured style that Moulin Avant itself is really known for. So it can be tannic and certainly age-worthy as well, just like its southern neighbor. Moulin Avant, I think, is one of the most well-known. It's certainly considered to be the most tannic, the most structured. Sometimes we see the use of new oak on Moulin Avant because the grapes and the wine can handle a little bit more of that. It's named for the historic windmill within the area. And oftentimes with age, and these wines certainly often need some age. Many people say that they probably need at least 5 years and maybe even up to 10 in the best vintages from the best producers to really show their best. And they also they call the wine pinoteur. They're saying that over time, the wines of Gamay coming from Moulin Avant really take on almost a Pinot Noir-like character that mirrors a little bit more the wines of Burgundy of the Côte d'Or coming from slightly further north as well. Now, the reason for some of the characteristics coming from the soil is the presence of what we call manganese, which is a mineral element that is toxic to plant growth or toxic to vine growth in high concentration. Now, within places like Moulin Avant, we have enough of this toxic chemical to vines that it lowers the yields and it stunts the growth. So this gives us actually a slightly more intense grapes than we might have in some of these other areas within Beaujolais itself. The negociant, George Duboeuf, is here. Chateau de Jacques, which is in a domain, a chateau owned by Louis Jadot, which is quite popular. I think he purchased it in 1996, but it's something that you'll commonly see as well. I really like Chateau Moulin Avant as well, and these wines certainly can take some age to them. So if you're looking for something a little bit more structured, certainly Moulin Avant is a great place to look. Now, we mentioned before the sort of terroir-driven styles of the region itself. So I think it's important to talk about maybe some of the lieux-dits that you might see on the labels as well. So when we talk about lieux-dits, we're essentially talking about a named parcel of land that's also been sort of noticed for its kind of cohesive terroir for creating a style of wine that is indicative of that particular area. So you might see areas like Le Clos or Champ de Cour, located right in the center here. And then a little bit further north, La Rochelle, Roscray, La Verriate. Oops, sorry. Just a little bit further to the northeast. So you can see those over here. And then we have some flatter lands here, but a lot of the great wines don't really come from these areas. They're not considered to be quite as high of quality. Moving down to Fleurie. That's what I'm drinking today. I know a few of you are drinking Fleurie today. I love these wines. Sometimes they're often called sort of the most feminine in style. And certainly, you know, they're called Fleurie for a reason. They do have this really floral character to them. The region itself, the cru, is actually named after a Roman legionnaire, but you can certainly see why you might want to call this a floral style of wine. When I opened this wine, I opened it maybe like 30 minutes before class, and I was like, wow, I'm going to drink this whole thing before we even get started because it is so tasty. And one of the things that I really love about Gamay and about Beaujolais as well is sometimes, and with this particular wine, you get some of the characteristics almost of a white wine, but within the framework of a red. So this wine does have some tannin to it. It's slightly noticeable, but it's really light. It's like a little bit dusty, but it has these really beautiful, almost like peach and apricot flavors along with the red fruit. And this like little hint of almost grapefruit, like this ruby red grapefruit. It keeps the wine really interesting, really refreshing. I tried to look at how this wine was made, and I couldn't actually find that information. But it's semi-carbonic. I just heard shouted from across the room.
2 weeks.
But it is the same producer as Claude Laureate, which is one of the most well-known producers within Fleurie, very commonly found within the shops in New York City as well. You might see Domaine de la Chapelle de Bois as well, and Domaine Chignard, which are both really popular. Le Cave des Producteurs des Grands Vins de Fleurie, really similar to what we saw in Juliana's as well, does produce a large percentage of these wines too. So about a third of these wines, but we can certainly think of Fleurie as being light, elegant, fragrant. In the north, when we're closer to Moulin-à-Vent, you might see some of these crus or these lieux-dits that might have some more richness to them. So Domaine de la Royette is really important for that on more of these granitic manganese-rich soils. So certainly important there. And then further in the south, I'm so sorry, there's a fruit fly like flying around in front of my face. Les Côtes Ventes, of course, down here, Chapelle de Bois, are all areas that are known for these really beautiful, lighter, fresher style. I do know that this wine comes from further south, so it's on a little bit of these slightly lighter soils than we see in the north, that are coming closer to neighboring Moulin-à-Vent as well. A lot of great producers coming out of the area. Famille Dutrabe, the négociant label of Jean-Louis Latrabe from Domaine de la Grande Croix, which we have here. Justin Dutrabe here. This is a really fun wine, Cuvée Spéciale, the natural wine. And then the classic producer, Claude Laureate. And then also Yvonne Matras, making wine out of the region as well. So a couple of producers that we really love. Cherubel, highest elevation cru. This is the coolest cru as well. So these will really be your light, sort of soft, wispy expressions. It's considered to be maybe the most Beaujolais-esque of all the crus themselves. It's known for its kind of younger drinking style. And we have a couple of producers that we really love, La Gros Pierre, but I also really love Damien Coquelet. So you see his Cherubels, we've carried it at Corkbud before. Damien is the stepbrother to Cuin Descombe, the son of George Descombe as well. So George Descombe is his stepdad. So the family is quite well connected within Burgundy, that as you might imagine. The soil composition in Cherubel is similar to what we see in Fleurie. It's a little bit more of that kind of pink granite, a little bit of sandstone. Can be really interesting for these lighter, fresher style wines. As we move down into Morgon, the second largest cru, you can see it's quite large here. A couple of really important areas. Côte-du-Py is one of the most important regions, one of the most important lieux-dits coming out of the area. This creates many of the appellation's most signature wines. We have a soil type known as Roche Pourri, which is this kind of broken up, this weathered iron-rich schist and basalt, streaked again with this manganese. So you can imagine that I'm about to tell you that oftentimes, because of this, we have these much more structured wines again. So we're looking at Moulin-à-Vent, we're looking at Morgon for these really structured styles. Morgon is the historical heartland of Kermit Lynch's Gang of Four, these producers, Marcel Lapierre, Jean Foyard, Jean-Paul Thévenet, and Guy Breton. And the other producer that I mentioned, George Descombe, not George Deboeuf, the Beaujolais Nouveau guy, but George Descombe. He is kind of considered to be the fifth unofficial member of this Gang of Four, these pioneers that wanted to promote natural styles of winemaking, and they really wanted to remind the world that Beaujolais had something other than Nouveau, that there were serious terroir-driven wines coming from the region itself. These are really some fantastic sites. Côte-du-Py, you'll see on a lot of different labels. I love Migodard makes a great wine coming from Côte-du-Py. You certainly see it coming from Foyard, one of my favorite producers of the Gang of Four. And in some of these lieux-dits, you get these kind of like spicier style of wine. So you're further in the south here for Côte-du-Py. And then my other favorite is Courcelette up here in the north, which is a little bit of like lighter, fresher, slightly rounder expression. But I think if you're looking for Morgon, you do see a lot of the wines coming from Côte-du-Py or from Courcelette. So quite common, you might see those. Here you have Jules, and you have the labels of his gang of four over here as well. So Guy Breton, Sevenet, you have Foyard, and Lapierre. Lapierre's children have taken over for him now, and they're doing really well, I think, for what they're doing with the wines too. In Renier, the latest, the youngest, the baby cru of Beaujolais, we might call it, became an AVA in 1988, joining two communes under the banner of Renier. We certainly see a little bit of production here, but much smaller than many of the other crus within the area. We're seeing a lot of this pink granite as well. And then we see a more early ripening appellation. So these will be some of the sort of earliest wines that you might see. They can be really aromatic, they're quite lively, and they sort of sit in the middle of that, you know, somewhere between like Cherubel and Fleurie and Morgon and Moulin-de-Vence. So they'll have some of these lighter, fresher, more floral characteristics, but a little bit slightly more of that seriousness that you might not get in Fleurie or Cherubel as well. Okay, Brouilly and Côte de Brouilly. Coming to our last couple of crus that we'll really discuss between the differences of these 10. So in Brouilly, the largest cru, so over 1,300 hectares, a lot of wine comes from the area. And then sitting within Brouilly, on Mount Brouilly, you see the Côte de Brouilly. Côte de Brouilly is unique because it actually has vines facing every direction. So you have vines in Côte de Brouilly that are facing north, south, east, and west. It's much smaller. We do see more weathered, poorer soils within this area as well. A really well-known producer of Côte de Brouilly is Chateau Thivan. And then also, a lot of the wine coming from Brouilly can be really fantastic. The Dutraub family makes some really great wine coming from Brouilly that I really quite like. They do about 20% of the total production of all of the cru. So this is an area that you're more likely to see. But if you're looking for some of these producers, I think Dutraub would be one of the best. Definitely worth trying. Chateau Thivan, I think you see quite commonly in a lot of wine shops, but definitely I think the most storied producer of the region as well. Côte de Brouilly will be more defined style coming out of the two areas. So Côte de Brouilly has a little bit more seriousness to it than what you might find within Brouilly. It's slightly more terroir specific because it is smaller, although you do have those different facing aspects. So that could give you a little bit of a difference in stylistically, depending on where the grapes are coming from within the region itself. We also really love Pierre Coton, make great wine coming out of the area, and another favorite of ours, Jean-Claude Lapalou. He makes some great Brouilly. He also makes some really great Beaujolais-Villages as well. If you're looking for a producer to try for Beaujolais-Villages, the Jean-Claude Lapalou wine can also be really fantastic. So what are we going to eat when we go to Beaujolais, you guys? Sometimes I feel bad when I'm putting these old world slides together because I realize when I get to the end that everything I put up here is meat specific. So I hope that I'm not offending any vegetarians with the classic foods of Lyon and Beaujolais. But a couple of things that are really quite common. I think a lot of people recognize Beaujolais and the Gamay grape to be a very food friendly, very versatile. You can pair it with a lot of different types of food. We always recommend if you're taking a bottle of wine to dinner or a bottle of wine to Thanksgiving, and maybe you don't know what's being served, or if you're looking for something to go with a Thanksgiving meal where you have a huge spectrum of things from crudité, with ranch to sweet yams with marshmallows, all the way to your turkey, and then this panoply of different sides that everybody brought to this Thanksgiving. You're looking for something that will try to tie in all of these different styles of food, then Gamay can always be a great option for that as well. And we know that it's versatile in the way that Pinot Noir is. So maybe if you are looking for something with some bright acidity, but a slight amount of structure, going to somewhere like Morgon would be a really fantastic option for you as well. But some of the classic foods, Lyon is At one time considered to be one of the greatest culinary meccas, I think, really within Europe, if not the world. Great chefs like Paul Bocuse came out of there. Daniel Boulud, of course, the Boulud restaurants here in New York City is also from Lyon himself as well. And they do have very humble foods, but they're perfectly paired with the wines themselves. The quenelle is extremely important. Mint fish, it's kind of like a dumpling that was served typically on the side, but now it's usually served in a sauce as a meal as its own right. So it's usually like a minced fish or meat that is puffed up with a little bit of egg and batter and then poached in some sort of stock. So it turns into almost like a dumpling. It can be served on the side with something or in its own sauce. You have the Rosette de Lyon, really traditional sausage of the region as well. French onion soup, of course, perfect for you vegetarians that are looking for something else. If you are vegetarian and you're going to the area, the lentils coming from here are really fantastic too. So you'll see a lot of lentil dishes, a lot of lentil soups. Oftentimes within Beaujolais, they're going to add meat to it, but I'm sure you can probably request it without. And of course, we consider coq au vin to be, you know, really historically connected to Burgundy itself. But here, of course, we're seeing it made with not Pinot Noir, but certainly with the Beaujolais itself. Some really fantastic styles happening here. How are we doing? Can I answer any questions? Oh, sorry, it gets really dark in here. I always forget. Can I answer any questions for you? How are we doing here? Let me take a look at the chat. I see. For the cru areas, is there any wine that is produced? Sarah, sorry, I lost your question. No, there's certainly, I don't know of a lot of examples where wines are produced within the area that are not released as cru wines, but I would certainly imagine that a producer might decide to declassify a wine, maybe in a poor vintage. There are producers like the Family de Trave that we talked about. I know some people are drinking the La Madone coming from Fleurie. They started a negociant business in 2016 because of a really tragic hailstorm where they lost about 90% of their crop that year. So a lot of producers might choose to declassify. In Saint-Amour, there is Chardonnay grown. I know it's released, oftentimes it's actually Bourgogne Blanc. Or you might choose to declassify to like a Beaujolais AOP or a Beaujolais wine. But, you know, if you have great fruit coming out of one of these more northern crus, it's to your economic advantage to release it as a cru wine. The only reason that a producer would choose not to do that is maybe they're waiting for their vine age to mature. And a lot of old vine, you know, in the crus, the vine age is on average much older than what you find in the rest of Beaujolais as well. Especially in places like Morgon, the Cuin d'Escombes, I know some people are drinking Vieille Vigne, old vine. Those vines are about 85 years old. So you see a lot of old vine coming from the area as well. So people might release it that way, but I don't think a lot of them would necessarily advertise that either. So, any other questions? John Paul Brune, we're talking about. Nicole, I'm glad you're liking it. Perfect, great. What's your favorite between the two? The Châtelard, the Fleurie, lighter, more floral, fresher, or the Morgon, the 85-year-old vine coming from Cuin d'Escombes. Lynn, that's a great quote. If nobody saw the quote that Lynn just put up here, he said, my favorite quote about Beaujolais is from the winemaker at Chateau de Jacques, so that's the Louis Jadot estate. In describing the difficulty of telling a good cru from Burgundy, said, when you drink it and the taste ends on an aristocratic note, it's Pinot. If it ends with a smile, it's Beaujolais. And I think maybe that's the way we should end this class as well. Is Beaujolais really, I think, gained a lot of importance after the financial crash in 2008 and 2009. And that's because a lot of people were looking for value-oriented wines, and they were looking for value coming from Burgundy, and there was not a lot of value to be found in the Côte d'Or, especially at that time. Now we're certainly finding more, or it's really difficult to find value in Burgundy on your own. If you're not familiar with the different appellations, and if you're not familiar with the producers, like if you don't know to look for the best producers, you know, Bourgogne Blanc or Bourgogne Rouge as well. So that can be really important, but there's great value in Burgundy. You have excellent winemakers. You know, there's sort of this juxtaposition in Burgundy where like half of the winemakers are over 50 and then the other half are under 25. So there's definitely, you know, I always say this in Burgundy, nepotism lives. It's really alive. There's a lot of people that, especially in Burgundy and Beaujolais is no exception, that take over domains from their parents. But I think it's really exciting that you see this, the sharing of information between the two, you know, age groups that are really looking to promote together the wines of the region, which is really quite important. And, you know, you can purchase one of these cru Beaujolais, something coming from Morgon, something coming from Milanavant. You might be able to find wines with, you know, 5 years of age, and you'll be spending, depending on who the producer is, but let's say around, you know, you spend $50 or $60 versus what are you spending for something of the same quality in the Côte d'Or? You're usually spending $100 or more. So the value to be found within Burgundy is something that can be really fantastic as well. I hope everybody enjoyed your Friday evening. Have a happy weekend. I'm excited to get back to my Cuvée Christie from Domaine Couder. Olaine Couder, of course, of Claude Laroyette, as we mentioned before. If you do have any questions, I hope you know where to reach me. It's amber@corkbuzz.com, or just stop by and say hi. Have a good night, everybody. I'll see you soon. So nice to see so many friendly faces. Really enjoyed having you here. Good night.